Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome to Decolonizing Russian History, Necessary, Corrective, or a Bridge Too Far. I'm Elise Giuliano. I'm political scientist and director of the master's program here and of this speaker series, which is called the Program on U.S.-Russian Relations. We have a special dedicated mailing list, so if you would like to be on that mailing list, please talk to Jordan, who is over here in the light shirt. He's the assistant for the program and a master's student at Harriman Institute. So I will just say a few words about the format, and then I'll introduce our speaker. I'm sure you will not be surprised to hear that there will be a talk in the first part of today's event of about 40 minutes, and then we will move to a question and answer period. And just please introduce yourself when you pose your question. So again, thanks for coming. And okay, yeah, I'm just going to give a very short bio of Nathaniel Knight, who is a historian of Imperial Russia. He has published numerous works on the history of Russian ethnography, Russian Orientalism, the Russian intelligentsia, and understandings of race and ethnicity in the Russian Empire. His most recent article is Skepticism, Faith, and the Problem of Historical Authenticity, Nikolai Nadezdin's Search for Truth, published in Canadian American Slavic Studies. He's also a professor at Seton Hall University.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm also an alumni of the Harriman Institute and Columbia University, and so it's always wonderful to be back here. I was sort of thinking like maybe I should rethink my whole talk, and it's an interesting moment to be talking about this topic when the direction that things will move with regard to Ukraine is so up in the air and fraught right now. But I have my things I have to say, so I'm going to say what I have to say, and maybe we can think about the implications in terms of the current moment when we have our question and answer. But I want to go back to the first days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine back in February and March of 2022. I think we all remember, after the weeks of buildup and uncertainty, that kind of nauseous feeling of horror and disgust. He's actually going through with it. It's actually going to happen. Certainly, in my view, the invasion represented a shattering of a liberal consensus in international affairs that had held since the end of World War II. Nations don't invade other nations. Nations don't lay claim to the territory of other nations. Nations in Europe, at least, don't launch unprovoked invasions to overthrow the governments of other nations. This is a violation of the rules of international relations in every possible respect. And then news began arriving from the front line that only enhanced this impression that unthinkable, horrific violations of human rights and dignity, just unapologetic slaughter. I always come back to that moment in Mariupol when the theater was bombed, with "Дети" written in huge letters on the pavement in front of it. And if there was ever a moment when moral standards are applicable in international affairs, this was certainly one. So how do we respond to that? How do we deal with this kind of situation? One thing that I certainly felt, and a lot of my colleagues felt, was the compulsion to act, the compulsion to do something. I know with my colleague Maxime Matusevich, we scrambled on the day of the invasion to hold an impromptu teach-in that was attended by large numbers of people. I recorded a video statement that went out on the department's social media. I did podcasts, media interviews, started making plans to host Ukrainian visiting scholars, and resolved to teach a new course in Ukrainian history, which I did the following semester and learned a lot from doing it. Other colleagues did even more, raising money, collecting supplies, arranging deliveries, etc. At a certain point, though, these actions started to seem a little bit inadequate. We wanted not just to place ourselves on the right side of history, but somehow to cleanse ourselves and our profession from the taint of association with a regime that could commit such atrocities. The point was repeatedly made by many, and myself included, that the war was really not just a matter of Putin, that it was in fact an entire imperial mindset that was at play, stretching deeply into the past and deeply ingrained in Russian culture, that viewed Russian identity as inseparable from the presence and practice of empire. And this Russian imperial mindset could never fully accept the breakup of the Soviet Union, and especially not the independence of Ukraine, which was the linchpin of the Russian Empire. It was in this context that calls for decolonization started to sound. Now, decolonization, of course, was nothing new. The literature on decoloniality goes back at least to the 1990s, if not before. It grows out of Western academic culture, especially thrives in departments of comparative literature and sociology, anthropology, philosophy, perhaps. Scholars like Walter Minola and Ladena Tlastanova see colonialism not just as political domination or physical occupation, but as an epistemological structure that permeates our view of the world and perpetuates the oppression of the global other. Decolonialism is closely linked with the discourse of settler colonialism, which irrevocably links Western society, historical genocide, and the continuing oppression of indigenous peoples. Applying the language of decolonization to Russia's aggression allows supporters of Ukraine to tap into the moral capital, the condemnatory force of anti-imperialism. It also usurps, with some justification in my view, Russia's own appeal to the global South, using the language of anti-colonialism to enhance its own credibility in Africa, South Asia, other parts of the world. It's not surprising, actually, that some of the original theoreticians of decolonization share with Putin's ideologists a common language of antipathy to a Western liberal order. This was not something that scholars applying the language of decolonization to Russia were particularly concerned about, though, in the months following the invasion. So one way or another, the language of decolonization has taken hold. Over the past few years, there has been a broad discussion in the field on the topic of decolonizing Russia and its former empire. ACES adopted decolonization as its theme for its 2023 conference and has hosted numerous panels on the topic. The ACES newsletter has made columns on decolonization a regular feature in its monthly issues. ACES prominent blogs in the field, the Jordan Center, H Russia, SICE in Vienna, regularly feature articles on decolonization. Journals like Ab Imperial and the Slavic Review have hosted forums on the topic. Occasionally voices of skepticism and critical inquiry have sounded. More often than not, though, this kind of takes the form of grumbling over drinks at the conference hotel bar, rather than clearly formulated critiques in print. But nonetheless, questions have been raised. Perhaps the most obvious question is, what do we actually mean by decolonization? The term itself can be quite fuzzy, although some helpful explanations have been put forth. It seems to me there are three ways, maybe more, that the term has been used. First, and perhaps least frequently, is decolonization in a literal sense. In other words, stripping away the Russian state of all its colonized territories and people. Some have argued that Russia will remain a threat until it no longer exists in its present form. Russia must be broken up and its subject peoples must be liberated and allowed to exercise their self-determination. Well, this may not sound reasonable in principle. In practice, my view is it's unimaginable. Short of total military defeat and physical occupation, it's hard to see how this could be put into effect, at least not without vast bloodshed and destruction. Basically, Russia would have to be colonized in order to be decolonized. And then there's the point that nobody has actually asked which of these Slavic peoples actually want to break away from Russia. Some may, but others, I'm thinking peoples of the Volga region, for example, almost certainly do not. A second use of decolonization is more figurative and more in line with its original meaning, stripping away from our disciplines the vestiges of a Russian colonial worldview. This has the advantage because it's under our own control. It's something we can actually do. Maybe we can't change Putin, but we can certainly change our syllabus. So we have to scrutinize our scholarship and pedagogy to scrub them clean of imperial narratives, tropes that place Russia on a higher plane than its subject peoples. A third use of decolonization that has become quite widespread is the notion of decentering. The idea that the historiography of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union has overwhelmingly privileged the Russian center. Other nations within the empire have been relegated to an incidental status. This is especially apparent in the literature and arts, where Russian culture has been crowned with the mantle of greatness, while other cultural traditions are ignored, if not actively effaced. Scholars, proponents of this idea suggest we should turn away from Russia and highlight the traditions and achievements of the present and former subjects of the empire. So does our field actually need this operation? Leads to a second question. How and when were we colonized? We have to decolonize, we must have been colonized at some point. To some degree, this seems like a counterintuitive proposition. Russian and Soviet studies took place in the context of the Cold War. And in the Cold War tradition, Russia was viewed as relentlessly colonial and expansionistic to its deepest essence. Non-Russian peoples were referred to as captive nations. I suppose probably not many of you remember the rhetoric around the invasion of Afghanistan, where they talked about this inexorable Russian urge to wash their boots in the Indian Ocean, this sort of thing about Russian expansionism. So there's a field that's infused with this kind of view of Russia. How could we be colonized? I would note, though, that among academics on the left, more the discourse of captive nations was often dismissed, even ridiculed, and much more credibility was actually granted to the Soviet trope of friendship of nations. And others have suggested a more subtle influence. And I can illustrate this from my own experience. I was trained as a historian of Russia right here. I mean, like literally, like in this room. This is where our seminars took place at the Harriman Institute in the second half of the 1980s. Things were changing, but the Cold War historiographical battle lines were still very much in place. I studied under Leopold Hampson, a domineering and inspiring presence, if there ever was one. I could tell a lot of stories. I'll refrain. Maybe a lot of anecdotes. I just remember when I went to my undergraduate Russian history teacher saying I wanted to study Russian history. I was thinking of Columbia, but I heard Hampson was difficult, and all she said was, "Well, the rewards are commensurate." And I can't speak for everyone. For me, that was true. I was also very fortunate to take courses with Mark Ryaff in my first year before he retired. Both Hampson and Ryaff were students of Michael Karpovich, who taught at Harvard University between 1927 and his retirement in 1957. Karpovich's other students included Richard Pipes, who took over for him at Harvard University, Martin Malia and Nicholas Rizanovsky, who led the Russian history program at Berkeley. These 5 scholars went on to train hundreds of graduate students who constituted much of the field. Actually, my other graduate advisor was Richard Wortman, who was a student of Hampson at his first job at University of Chicago. So Karpovich himself received his graduate degree from Moscow University, where he attended the lectures of the great Vasily Kluchevsky, a towering figure in Russian historiography, whose work represented the culmination of the tradition of the state school in Russian history. Russia was, in Kluchevsky's view, an empire that colonized itself. Unlike Western Europe, Russia's expansion was natural and organic, as the Russian people, largely on its own accord, spread out across the territory of Eurasia, seemingly destined to them by nature. Interesting parallels with the American discourse of manifest destiny. The path of Russian history was a seamless progress in its early years. Well, it was a seamless progress in which the Tsarist autocracy, the glue that held together the expanding state, gradually accommodated an emerging nation, which would eventually come to its own and take control of Russia's destiny. Non-Russian peoples are largely absent from Kluchevsky's narrative. To the extent that they appear, it's either as forces to be overcome or as part of the larger flow of Russia's historical progress. Of course, this doesn't exhaust the totality of Kluchevsky's work. He was a brilliant master of historical synthesis. He combined psychological insight with an artist's eye for detail and a broad view of the dynamic forces shaping Russia's development. As graduate students, we were encouraged to mine his 5-volume course of lectures, preferably in the original Russian, to savor to the fullest his literary gifts. And Kluchevsky, following the path of his own teacher, Sergei Solovyov, presents the sweep of Russian history as an unbroken procession, starting with the Varangian warriors, the Rus, into the turbulent principalities of Kiev and Rus, to the emergence of a powerful breakaway principality of Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast region. And then, of course, come the Mongol invasions, which in Kluchevsky's view, well, decimated Kiev and the central regions of Rus, but left Vladimir Suzdal standing, albeit under the Mongol yoke. Yet the Mongols, in Kluchevsky's view, had little impact on the internal development of the Principality of Muscovy that grew out of it and came to rule over Vladimir Suzdal. Kluchevsky acknowledges the existence of Galicia Volhynia in the west, where a branch of the Rus princes survived the Mongols and thrived for several generations before being absorbed into the growing kingdom of Poland. Yet there was never any question in Kluchevsky's view that the Muscovite grand princes were legitimate heirs to the legacy of Kiev and Rus. So how much of this narrative structure, or how much did this narrative structure influence what we were taught as graduate students? To the extent that we delved into this earlier period, I would say quite a bit. Our early Russian history seminar was actually taught by Edward Keenan from Harvard, who came to teach us during a semester when he was on leave. I recall a brilliant discussion of steppe nomads in the East and their symbiotic trade relations with the Muscovite state. But we also started with Kiev and Rus and moved seamlessly into Muscovy. Ukraine as a separate entity did not figure prominently in the discussion, although I do recall the emphasis he placed on the influence of Ukrainian clerics and intellectuals in the Muscovite court in the decades prior to the reign of Peter the Great, but again, from the perspective of Moscow. In short, the narrative of Russian history we learned in graduate school followed the thread of the Russian state and Russian society. Ukraine was mentioned from time to time, but primarily as a region of the empire, perhaps with its own distinctive character and tradition, not so much as a nation in its own right. One exception were the seminars of Mark von Hagen, who switched his focus to Ukrainian history in the mid-1990s. But even in his seminars taught in the 80s, were still fairly Russocentric. Georgia received similar treatment. We knew it was there. Certainly you couldn't study the Mensheviks in 1917 without being aware of their strong Georgian roots. Then, of course, there was Stalin to be accounted for. So, but it was really only when I began my own dissertation research into the history of Russian ethnography that the multi-ethnic character of the Russian Empire started to loom larger in my understanding. So on the face of it, then it would appear that this is a field that's ripe for decolonization, right? The focus was overwhelmingly on the imperial center. Colonial subjects were largely neglected, and we rarely discussed the Russian Empire in a comparative context alongside European colonial empires. Perhaps it was just the courses I took, but I barely remember even a mention of Central Asia, the Russian Empire's most classic colonial possession. So what's to be done? Well, the literature on decolonization proposes a clear set of remedies. Shift the focus away from the state, shift the focus away from the center, build new narratives highlighting the autonomy and agency of colonized people, emphasize, for example, the Ukrainian character of Kiev and Rus and the sharp rupture between Kiev and Rus and the Muscovite autocracy, which often presented as more Mongol in some ways than Rus, dethrone the notion of cultural greatness, and understand that such tropes of greatness are inseparable from colonial domination, reclaim figures subsumed into a larger imperial identity for their respective nations. So stop calling Gogol a Russian writer. Of course, never mind the virulent Russian nationalism in his later years. Stop calling Quinji and Ivazovsky and Repin Russian painters. And of course, continue to support former subjects in their struggle to resist neocolonial aggression. So that's decolonization. What would anyone have against such a program? Well, I'd like to present 6 points, maybe theses perhaps, that may problematize or complicate the decolonization paradigm. And hopefully I won't take too much time. We can talk about it. First thing, actually, we've already been doing this. This is not new. The 1990s actually changed the narrative substantially. Up through the 1980s, the dominant questions driving the historiography concerned the legacy and legitimacy of the Russian Revolution, the relationship of Stalin to the legacy of the revolution. Was Stalin a feature or a bug of the revolution? And also the potential of late Soviet society to evolve into a more open, pluralistic regime while retaining its socialist character. These are the things we talked about in the 1980s. After the 1990s, the emphasis shifted to explaining why the Soviet Union had shattered, which brought into sharp focus the character and aspirations of the nationalities, which is what we all called them back in those days. A new generation of scholars, armed with new questions, flooded the archives, and by the late 1990s, the results were appearing in print. One prominent journal has recently characterized the period from 1995 to 2010 as a golden age for Russian imperial studies. Scholars like Terry Martin, Yuri Sloskin, Fran Hirsch, Robert Geraci, Paul Worth, Willard Sunderland, Chuck Steinwedel, many others, probed deeply the place of ethnic groups within the larger structure of the empire. The picture was ambivalent and nuanced. Yes, there was violence, compulsion, oppression, to which the Russians were also subjected, but there was also affirmation and cultivation of particularistic identity, flexibility, irregularity, potential for integration and advancement, spread of literacy, all of these things kind of going on at the same time in this complicated picture. Most of these studies proceeded from an admittedly Russocentric perspective, although indigenous perspectives were by no means absent. There were other angles as well developing. During the 1990s, opportunities arose for scholars to travel to newly independent former republics, learn the languages, and build new scholarly identities. The fields that developed, I would emphasize, are not mere subfields of Russian imperial studies. They're rather full-fledged fields in their own right. This is most apparent in Central Asian studies, which has blossomed into a vital and dynamic field of scholarship with its own academic infrastructure, its own conferences, journals, university chairs, etc. Scholars like, I'm sorry for the name dropping, but Adib Khalid, Virginia Martin, Adriana Edwards, Robert Cruz, Jeff Sacadeo, Ian Campbell, Alexander Morrison. There are a lot of people. Gulnar Kindabay, who's right here with us. Straddled the gaps between Central Asian societies and the Russian Empire and did not shy away from highlighting the colonial nature of the Russian presence. More recently, I would say there's been a kind of second wave, a new generation of scholars who have emerged more firmly rooted in the Central Asian context with a strong mastery of Central Asian languages, whose narratives reflect a perspective from within Central Asian society, and for whom history doesn't begin in the 1860s with the conquest of Central Asia, but see it as an unbroken succession. Scholars like this, and I'm thinking of people like Paola Sartori and Danielle Ross, often actually find themselves housed in departments of Middle East studies and Islamic studies rather than Russian and Eurasian studies centers. Ukrainian studies is a little bit of a different picture. Here we have a field that was already well developed in Soviet times, of scholars like Emilian Pritzik, Paul Magotsi, Orest Septenli, Zenon Kalhun, Frank Sisson, who taught here quite a bit. Others had generated a substantial literature even during the Soviet period, building on the legacy of pre-revolutionary Ukrainian historiography, especially the work of Mikhailo Khrushchevsky. The large Ukrainian diaspora in the US, especially Canada, was a seed bed for this historiography. And then in the 1990s, you have scholars with roots in Ukraine proper kind of joining into this literature and building on it, thinking like people like Sergei Yekochuk and Sergei Plokhy, many others. One could provide a similar survey to the historiography of the peoples of the Caucasus, Baltics, Siberia. The point is that these are well-developed fields of scholarship in their own right. They've done quite well decolonizing themselves, and they don't need any help from Russianists in freeing their field from a colonial mentality. And they certainly don't need repentant Russianists colonizing their field in order to satisfy their own urge to decolonize. On the other hand, they probably wouldn't mind if we actually read their books, read their works, and to the extent possible, integrated this knowledge into our teaching and scholarship. Okay, so that's my first point. Second point is on this idea of decentering. And I'm all for integrating regional perspectives into our scholarship and teaching about the Russian Empire. In fact, since 2005, I've been teaching a course on the Eurasian frontier in Russian history, which has been really revealing, and I've learned a great deal. But there's a limit to how far we can take decentering. For better or for worse, the Russian Empire was a highly centralized political formation. One can't understand the impact of the empire on its subject regions without understanding decision-making processes and cultural trends in the center. And historical narratives that highlight the view from the subject regions certainly have their place, and this is the framework within much national historiography takes place. But such works have limited explanatory power with regard to the dynamics of the empire as a whole. Moreover, views that shut out the center miss an important element in understanding how developments in the periphery actually shape the cultural framework of the empire as a whole. For example, how Russian literature and culture was shaped in the first half of the 19th century by Russia's wars of conquest in the Caucasus, and how geopolitical frameworks and nationalist thought was impacted by Russia's impact in expansion into Central Asia in the 1860s and 1870s. And these are issues that have in fact generated a substantial literature, especially since the 1990s. Okay. So my third point concerns how historical frameworks have changed over time. It's not accidental that the 1990s saw an imperial turn. E.H. Carr famously characterized history as a dialogue between past and present. The present forms the questions that historians ask of the past. And naturally, the questions in any given year will point historians toward particular subjects and particular bodies of sources. So for Khrushchevsky and the state school of Russian historiography before the revolution, the guiding question focused on autocracy. Why had this particular form of rule played such a dominant role in Russian history? Could it be seen as a stage in a historical trajectory that would ultimately lead to the liberation and empowerment of the nation and the individual? To address these questions, the narrative thread tended to follow closely the evolution of the state, and particularly the development of a structure of law within the framework of autocracy. Ethno-national identity was of limited relevance to this particular historical narrative. So, for the scholars of the Cold War era, revolution was the guiding problematic. All you have to do is just go to a bookshelf and string together the titles of some of the major historical works from the time, and you get the full story. Historians traced roots of revolution, Jarmolinsky, to the Finlandization, Wilson, to understand how the Bolsheviks came to power. That's Rabinowitz during Red October. Daniels. So that's the story, story of the revolution. The focus initially was on ideology and intellectual history, movements and discourses in which intellectuals from various national backgrounds participated in the revolutionary struggle. Then came the wave of revisionist historiography in the 1970s, 1980s, and the focus shifted towards social history with the narrative structure defined through the lens of class. But again, national identity was a secondary issue in this historiography. We spent a lot of time in Leopold Haemsen's seminar thinking about the peasants of Kharkov and Poltava provinces in 1902. Yeah. And what was important was not whether they spoke Ukrainian or Surzhyk or Russian, but the fact that they were subjected to a particularly grueling form of exploitation from noble landowners as commercial agriculture took hold, and responded to this by raiding and burning noble estates. All right. Likewise, it's it's equally understandable why ethnicity came into focus as a subject of historical inquiry in the 1990s. So could it be that what seems to be vestiges of a colonial epistemology may actually just be the responsiveness of historians to the questions framed by the eras in which they lived? So, and speaking of epistemology, get to my fourth point. I think it's fair to say that whatever questions historians address, they still share a baseline assumption that there is an underlying historical truth. Multiple narratives about the past, multiple stories do not amount to multiple truths, right? In this regard, the epistemological framework advanced by theoreticians of decolonization is rather problematic for historians. The idea that there can be a decolonial epistemology that discredits and displaces colonial knowledge in all its forms, including science, is rather hard to swallow. It's one thing to critically analyze colonial ideology, to reject the validity of things like social Darwinism, eugenics, racial science, while uncovering their connections to colonial oppression. But that doesn't mean that all knowledge, all science from the era of colonialism is inherently invalid. We have to use our critical capacity to separate the wheat from the chaff. Moreover, the fact that the political winds at any particular moment may be blowing in a particular direction does not necessarily mean that we should abandon our critical perspective and accept unquestionably ideas and assertions that appear dubious simply because they fall in line with decolonial epistemologies. And what example might be this relationship between Kievan Rus and the early Muscovite principality? There are a variety of ways of understanding this, and many are worth considering, but some are clearly implausible. I'm happy to discuss this in further detail if anyone's interested. And this actually gets to another point about nationalist historiographies. And as an example of this problem, from the 1990s onward, there has been an enormous interdisciplinary literature on issues of ethnicity and nationality. You're probably familiar with the major works, Benedict Anderson, Ernst Gellner, Rogers Brubaker, Fred Cooper. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have read these works. Much of this work has focused on complicating our understanding of group identity. Constructivist frameworks will reject primordialist or essentialist views that reify the nation and cast its unchanging existence stretching back into the indefinite past. Ethnic and national identities, we've come to realize, are contingent, multifaceted, often liable to be mobilized in an instrumental manner for political ends. Yet the discourse of decolonization tends to fly in the face of these scholarly understandings. Recent commentators have noted an element of blood and soil ideology in the discourse of settler colonialism, for example. The idea that there is one authentic indigenous population that has had physical and spiritual ties to a particular region since time immemorial, and all other inhabitants are illegitimate interlopers, settlers, colonists, perhaps later immigrants whose presence was facilitated by the fact of colonization. But how does one distinguish between authentic historical migration and colonization? The early history of Eurasia is one of uninterrupted migrations, often accompanied by extreme violence. Actually, you see this in early Russian history. Great deal. And in fact, DNA studies are painting a gruesome picture of just how violent it was. There's been some really interesting studies about the expansion of Proto-Indo-European peoples, as looking at gender differentiations in DNA studies, which can only be explained by a model in which invading groups essentially slaughtered the male populations and raped the female population for children. And this is how the Indo-European peoples, all of the ancestors Indo-European peoples spread. So, you know, in some ways we're all settlers, we're all tainted in some ways. I mean, the past is filled with violence and injustice. Settler colonialism, though, it mandates a sharp distinction between colonialism and indigeneity. But what are we to do about complex hybrid identity? Research on nationality shows clearly that people are rarely just one thing. Ethnography can be overlapping, it can be nested, it can be situationally deployed. Faith Hillis's book, Children of Rus, shows how a Malorasiski identity combined Ukrainian local identity with a Russian imperial identity. The little Russian patriots of the 1860s, 1870s found common ground with Russian nationalists in their shared antipathy to Polish landowners and the Jewish commercial class. Right. And the complex relationship between local ethnic identity and overarching imperial identity also runs afoul of the decolonization paradigm. Far too often, Russian ethnic and Russian imperial identity are assumed to be one and the same, exclusive to its bearers, therefore absolving anyone who is not ethnically Russian from participation in the Russian imperial project. Yet not so long ago, we were learning from Alexander Etkind, among other people, that the Russian folk itself was a victim of a vicious internal colonization. Complicated. I think these disjunctions illustrate just how distant the discourse of decolonization is in many ways from the historical realities of the areas that we study. The decolonization paradigm is largely, I would argue, a product of American identitarianism and academic culture. It's not necessarily an easy fit with the academic culture of the areas we study. It's not accidental that the loudest voices calling for decolonization have been coming not so much from Ukraine itself, but from Ukrainians acculturated into the norms of Western academia. The awkward question it was raised by Sergei Abashin in a challenging blog post, whether by insisting on the universality of the decolonization paradigm, we're not engaging ourselves in a subtle form of neo-imperialism, a kind of civilizing mission. In the end, by way of conclusion, okay, for too long, but we have to wonder, who is this all really for? Is the decolonization movement actually helping Ukrainians and other colonized people? Or is this a performative gesture, a kind of ritual self-purification? The more I think of decolonization, the more I see a kind of substrate of Christian cosmology. Protestant, specifically Puritan, to be even more exact, colonization is a kind of original sin, rooted deep in the past, but tainting us all. We can't erase the stain of colonialism. The damage is done. Literal decolonization is impossible. We can't turn that back to the past, but we can do everything possible to purify ourselves from the vestiges of imperialism in our own lives, our own culture, and repent, always repent, in the hope that we can be accepted as one of the elite. And this in turn gives us the right to condemn others who may not be as vigorous in their purification and repentance. okay, but is this really helping the Ukrainians win the war? I'll end it with that. So, and look. Right. Look forward to your questions and thoughts and arguments.
Yeah, wow, a lot to think about there. So I'm happy to collect some questions. And yes, please introduce yourself briefly.
Hi, my name is Laura. Thank you so much for the lecture. I'm a second-year undergraduate student. So my question was very kind of similar to your conclusion in terms of do you think is the role of specifically Western academia regarding Russian colonialism? Because when I think about decolonization, I think about a lot of Western academia focusing on Western colonialism. And then there's like a very clear action item and a very clear kind of connection, because you can watch, or like, these are your leaders, this is your history, versus when it's done in a Western context and it's not coming from Russia. On the contrary to a lot of anti-colonial studies that come from Britain or from US universities. So what is the role, do you believe, of Western literature regarding Russian colonialism?
Okay. Thanks. Do you want to collect more questions, or should I go one by one?
Let me see, does anyone at this point have another question? Then why don't you just
Okay,
answer?
good. Well, yeah, that's a really important question. Because, I mean, obviously my argument is, not, diving too deeply into this decolonization, but on the other hand, there are, I mean, if you look at the historiographical and the historical discourse in Putin's Russia, it is filled with falsifications and distortions and nationalistic narratives. And I think our first duty is simply not to repeat and not to validate these tropes. I mean, we may not want to go too far the other direction, but and then I think the other thing that we can do as academics is to provide a model of our best version of what conscientious scholarship looks like, and engage with our Russian colleagues who are and this is one of the real tragedies of the war, is the way that it's broken off the connection, where I certainly have many scholarly connections in Russians, and people I've worked with over for long periods of time and gotten to know well, and I think maintaining these channels of communication, these networks, is one of the most important things we can do in terms of creating a kind of common language and a common a common kind of world of shared knowledge and shared assumptions that we can build from, and that help scholars in Russia and just reading publics in Russia sort of inoculate themselves to some degree against the nationalistic rhetoric. But I see that as a much more positive way of contributing to.
Yes.
My name is Alexander. I was a undergraduate student at the history department here, and my question is devoted to the Imperial mindset. You mentioned this term in the beginning of your presentation, and how can you define this category, and what extent you deal with the opinion that the Imperial mindset is a crucial driver for the current war?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It was a sort of big revelation back, in the 1990s, that there are actually these two types of Russianness. There's Ruski and Rossiyski, and that they're actually not really the same thing, and that you could actually be Rossiyski and not be Ruski at all. But then the difficulty is, it's not that simple, actually. I think that's what we came to realize after a certain point, because the two are very much intertwined and interwoven. And a lot of, Russia's identity as a great power, Russia's status as a great power, the recognition of Russia internationally as a superpower, as a great power, is really important, I think, to a lot of how Russians think of themselves and think of the world, and certainly in the Soviet Union, I think that was very important. And the identity of I mean, there's this idea of a Soviet people, which was sort of supposed to be taking shape, from there was a whole discourse of how the Soviet people, what was it, Sliania and
Giuliano.
Sliania and Sliania to create this new Soviet people. But I think these kinds of things matter, and I think Ukraine occupies a particularly important place in this imperial mindset. Because in some ways it's the three-legged stool of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus that creates the foundation in some ways that the empire rests on. And when you don't have Ukraine, it's hard to really see it as being an empire anymore, being a great power, and being simply a federation. It is I think for from this point of view, it's jarring, and not to mention the interaction, the connections, the back and forth, the interwovenness of Russian and Ukrainian lived experience over the years, especially in the Soviet period, but in recent years as well. I mean, and what that led to is a kind of color blindness. I think it's Ted Weeks uses this term, national Daltonism, national color blindness, where Russians would go to Ukraine, they'd hang out in Kiev, they'd meet their relatives and friends in Ukraine, and they'd think, oh, Ukraine's just like Russia. Everyone speaks Russian there, and this is, but because that's what they would see, and the side of Ukraine that was not at all Russian, and they would simply be, would be not part of their experience. It was a kind of like siloed or bifurcated way of experiencing. So there's not this common Russian assumption that, oh, they're just like us. These Ukrainians just like us. Which is sort of understandable from the experience, but doesn't reflect the reality of how Ukrainians actually saw their own lives and existence and culture. So.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Robert Lee. I'm a third-year PhD student in English and Conflict. Thank you so much for the talk. So my question is related to when you characterize this push for decolonization as, it's arising out of a bit of an emotional freak out, right? When the war happened.
Good way of putting it.
But I mean, in the talk, you correctly pointed out a lot of the issues with the decolonization narrative, the potential of some blood and soil and nationalism, too perfect each separation between colonized and colonized peoples, which is not really the case. And I mean, arguably, this is a problem in the study of applying decolonization to even Western empires, I think, not only Russian. So there's a lot of issues with that framework. I wonder if you had any sense of if the decolonization framework has these issues, what might be a better way of studying empire? Do you think we should just, keep doing the work that the Slavic studies field has been doing and continue in that vein? Or do you think there were maybe underneath the emotional panic some genuine methodological issues that were identified that you could actually address in a very critical?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I really don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I realize that there are very real issues, very real problems, and there's real work to be done in terms of developing awareness of the just sort of the ontological fact of these peoples that are out there. And it's kind of ironic because in my own work where I study the history of Russian ethnography, and I've actually pushed back a little bit from the literature of constructivism that sort of posits ethnic identity as a kind of mirage or as something that is just sort of put together in this situational way, without any real substance to it. Or I think it does matter, And it does, and yes, partly it comes back to think, maybe I'm old fashioned or something, but I do believe there's such a thing as culture, and I think it matters. And I think that cultures are different, and we could talk about them. So I think fostering a realization and a respect for particularity, for difference, but at the same time understanding that the difference is deployed in complex ways, and it's not exclusive, and it's not limiting, and it's not. Yeah, one way I think of culture sometimes is like it's a bunch of little fish in a big net. In a sense, it keeps, the big net keeps everything all together. In other words, culture is a form of collective behavior, right? But individuals can swim through the holes in the net. Individuals you can learn new cultures, you can become enculturated, so you have fluidity, at the same time where you also have substance to the collective phenomenon. And so I think, trying to think about these things in more nuanced and sophisticated ways, I think is helpful, and avoiding falling into, on the one hand, nationalist discourse, and on the other hand is kind of, I think they're, kind of constructivist nihilism or something, say that nothing really exists. So, yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Miriam, a recent master's graduate here at the Institute here at Columbia. My question was also related to the emotional freakout you mentioned about wanting to purge yourself from dissociation. And certainly, I think it's an important historiographic conversation. But this point briefly came up at a recent Sovietology conference with Patrick and NYU, which is why us, why Russian historians? Because, for instance, when Le Pen got into the second round in 2017, or even her father, it's not like French historians were spilling over saying, how do we hit this? And is this a responsibility we have to completely purge our field and so on? So why is this sense of responsibility placed at the feet of Russian historians? But certainly during the Soviet Union, historians had the eyes of intelligence departments and so on. But it seems like since the 90s, with the decline of funding and so on, it's not really the case. Or is, but why is this? Or is this even assigning historians too grand self-importance, maybe?
That's a good point. Yeah. I think I sort of, mentioned this briefly, but I think, one of the problems with this moment of the emotional freakout is the sense of lack of agency, lack of control. We don't. This terrible thing is happening around us, and it's happening to a place and to people that we know well, and we're engaged with deeply, and we have an emotional commitment to, and the sense of wanting to take action, wanting to be able to do something, and then also, and maybe this is getting at the kind of strain of Puritanism that I was talking about, but this idea of sort of reflecting things back on the self, and wanting to engage in this purification, this self, in order to purify yourself, and also feel like you've done something important and kind of come out better for it, and you collectively as a field, we've done something important by doing this work, and come out better for it. So I that's kind of where I see it coming from, those types of impulses. I don't know. I mean, will American historians have the same kind of impulse about Trumpism on Trump? I don't know. That's interesting to think about, but I kind of doubt it.
Nassim?
He's my department chair now. Yeah, gotta be careful.
And you both term presentism, and I was thinking back maybe on the events of 3 or 4 years ago, there was this big flare up of the American Historical Association, and the president published a letter on presentism, and a lot of flack.
Yeah.
And that created the invasion of Ukraine. And you already addressed this issue. I was wondering, this whole discourse of colonization, and you mentioned the post-Puritan roots. And just to expand the focus a little bit, to what extent actually it has to do with Russia and Ukraine, versus with something that's happening within this society, especially in English-speaking academic and English-writing academic world, whereby we see the series of moral panics on both sides of the political spectrum. So I wonder if some deeper forces are at play here, and this is just the latest manifestation of something that has been happening in this culture for a number of years now.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was sort of pointing in that direction a little bit in my conclusion. That I think we're at a fraught moment in academia, and certainly the cultural credibility and prestige of academia is sinking very, very quickly in our and meanwhile we're constantly trying to find new ways of formulating ourselves and finding a kind of moral equation that allows us to speak to our society in ways that we think are important without alienating the people that we're talking to and the people we're listening to. And it's a dilemma. It's difficult. And there's a tendency to want to always rush to the service of justice in whatever form that we see it taking place, whatever form we see injustice taking place. The problem is when you get into this epistemological dilemmas, where in a sense the service of justice is based on bodies of knowledge that are flawed, and maybe the cause is good, maybe the impulses are good, but the evidence is not, and so what do we do? Do we I mean, as it was James, what's his last name, the chair, Sweet, yeah, James Sweet, yeah, who rushed in and said, well, wait a minute, that's not actually the way it was, in the African slave trade, and actually, more people going to the Caribbean than to the American, and all sort of, kind of like almost like an annoying history professor who's like making notes on a paper and says, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about that, and of course his points were well taken. But it exploded politically because these were not the things that served the larger agenda at that moment in time. And I think it's certainly not as bad in the whole discourse of decolonization with Russia, but I think we've seen some situations like that. And certainly some of the more extreme formulations of the sort of anti-Russian sentiment that you've seen being voiced, and kind of historical narratives that's embedded in, and it does come a moment where you have to kind of stick to your guns in some ways as a scholar, and say, well, actually, I'm not going to buy into that narrative, because that's not what my sources are telling me. That's not what the historiography has, but it's a difficult moment, but I think we need to be careful, and I think historians in particular, about sort of swinging to the winds of popular sentiment and the impulse to serve justice, when it means moving away from truth, or from how we see truth. I don't think that's a
I'm Carol Harriman, former professor of Russian, now retired. I have a question, which is Russian historians in Europe. They've been focused on the American point of view and kind of the burden of Puritanism. They don't have that. They have their own thing, but I just wonder, do they have a separate contribution to the decolonization or not?
That's interesting. That's a really interesting point. I'll have to think a little bit more about it. But I think there's we tend to use the word Anglo-American a lot. So I think in the English language literature, I think there's less of a division in terms of the strains in the historiography. I think we read each other's work often without necessarily even thinking, okay, this person's at Oxford, or this person's, whatever. And part of the problem is that American historians just don't read a lot of the European historians who write in the European languages. We don't, I mean, I'm struggling to learn to read German. It's not easy, but, and French I can read when I have to, but the only times I'll really read a book in French is if I have to write a book review on it. And it's not, I mean, boy, back, the days when we had scholars like Hameson and Ryeff. I mean, these were people whose parents were refugees from the Russian Empire and who grew up in the Russian emigre community in Europe in the interwar period. So Ryeff grew up in his early years in Germany, and then he did his high school years in France, went to Elise, and then came to America and went to Harvard. And Hameson grew up in Belgium, and grew up speaking French actually more as his native language, and spoke Russian in the family, and learned German somewhere along the way. So for people like that, having the European languages was just a natural fact, so that they were very in tune with the European historiographies and scholars. It's not like that now, and now we have the pressure. Actually, partly part of this, decolonization. If you have to choose what language do you learn, is it going to be Kazakh or Uzbek or Ukrainian or Georgian, or is it going to be German? It's and so it is. It does make it harder to really deeply engage with historiography in non-English languages. A lot of European scholars, of course, will write in English. And it's a shame they have to do that, but in some ways it's what it takes to bring their scholarship to a larger community. I don't know if that answers your question, but then yeah.
There's a lot of thinking, and probably because
Yeah.
each of the European countries has its own credible history.
Oh,
Think
yeah,
of
yeah.
Germany, France,
Oh, of
that-
course, yeah,
That's
yeah.
going to, but this particular strain of Puritanism is what interests. me.
Yeah,
It seems to
yeah,
me that it wouldn't be identical there.
yeah.
Thinking about recent ACES conferences, it seems a lot of the Europeans who now come to it in droves
Mhm.
actually were talking in these terms of decolonization quite early on.
Mhm.
So that's why I wondered if it were an independent
Oh.
process.
Oh, that's and actually the discourse of decolonization in regard to the Russian Empire, also didn't begin with the invasion of Ukraine. This is, but it has been around for a while as well. But I think you're right about I know, for example, with Germany, there's the whole huge issue of the Holocaust, which creates certain sensibilities, certain sensitivities that you may not see in other areas, and shapes the way they might think of a question like decolonization or understanding the genocide.
Yes, yeah, please.
Yes, yeah, and Oleg Kudinsky and fellow Woodman Center, libraries here. Thank you for excellent talk. And I guess my question directly related to what you are talking about. It's I fully agree with you that culture matters, and as we know, the several part of Ukrainian citizens are people of Russian culture, that Ukrainian president, right?
Yes, yeah.
And from your point of view as a historian ethnographer, is it possible actually to exercise Russian culture from Ukrainian citizens? And if perhaps that is the most important and difficult, issue of decolonization.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess the question is, can you have a common culture and separate identities? And I think what we're seeing in Ukraine is, yes, you can. Because the Ukrainian identity in some ways, even, I mean, it's been really interesting, and I haven't tracked it closely, but to see how Eastern Ukraine has evolved over the past few years, and how, and in fact, the contrast between 2014 and 2022 in the situation now, where there was a lot of opposition to Maidan within Ukraine, and especially from the east, and not just from Donbass, but from from the Kharkiv region, from other areas, and now you really don't see that. And in part, it is the the way that a kind of the awareness of an enemy, in a sense, animosity creates identity, irregardless of culture, I think. And so yes, you can have common culture. I think a lot of the Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine have switched or are trying to switch into Ukrainian. So, but certainly not everyone, and certainly not the older generations. But my sense is that being Russophone is not an obstacle to seeing yourself as being Ukrainian. That's my understanding of it. I don't, and Ukrainian particular identity, that I mean, yeah, it's a subtle thing. I mean, even in Imperial Russia, there were a lot of Ukrainians who were not ready to jump on the Ukrainian national bandwagon and saw their Ukrainianism as a regional identity. Like how you might see, being from New Orleans is a regional identity, very particular way of speaking, viewing the world, a kind of attitude, a culture, music, all of these things being Creole, that's you can have that kind of regional identity within the context of a larger whole. And that's the way for long periods of time, Ukrainian identity was experienced in some part. On the other hand, in Galicia and Volhynia and these areas are totally different way. So I hope that's it.
Just made me think about the research that I found myself in, which was about people fighting against Russian oppression in the early 19th century. And maybe some of this decolonization should start a little earlier instead of looking at it in the 1990s, because you had, first of all, the Tsar forbade the use of Ukrainian in Ukrainian schools in 1878. So there was a push much earlier, and there was a whole group of people trying to make Ukrainian a legitimate language earlier.
Sure,
So, but I found, I have to say, I was working on this before anybody talked about these questions, and there was less interest than I think there should have been.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way things were in the historiography. But yeah, I mean, I think it's in some ways, Ukraine goes through a classic national awakening that follows the pattern of other national, just right along the scheme of Miroslav Volk, and in some ways contemporaneously with the Czechs and other Eastern European nations, and you have the same kinds of things going on. Kulish creates the Ukrainian dictionary. You've got Kritka with first Ukrainian poetry. This is all going on in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s. So this idea that that Ukraine is not has no nationhood, and it was meant by Lenin, I mean, you can trace it almost as right as parallel lines.
I just wanted to add that I might be the one Russian historian who had the book translated not into Russian but into Ukrainian.
Yeah. Good for you.
Yeah, do you have a question?
This Ukrainian.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you think that actually strengthen this discourse of decolonization? Perhaps like in broader or more general terms, like reach a larger community, like in the I'm just wondering, like, is scholarship in general nowadays just being kind of dismissed or not really considered as serious? And I'm also interested in the role of using media, using video, publication, etc. If that could be helpful to share more scholarship, or even media itself as being, it can be used as just like to undermine the whole purpose of sharing, like, you produce, historiography and ethnography and the like. And I'm just curious how much you can get a scholar of add to that and where scholarship is nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of scholarship, I think the most important thing we could do is just to do it, have to have the scholarly literature and to have that standard, but and also, as I've been arguing, really try to foster a more a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of these relationships. But in terms of media, that's a tricky thing. Social media has played an enormous and ambivalent role in a lot of these. On the one hand, it's an incredible source of information, and something that's the only way you can go to to actually find out what's going on a day by day or even hour by hour basis in a lot of these areas. And but it's also a ground where the gravitational pull is toward the extremes, and toward the inflammatory rhetoric, and that's something that scholars have to I think have to kind of push back against. I think there are there are intermediate venues where scholars can kind of package their research in a way that's accessible to broader audiences without resorting to, little bits and pieces on X, or in fact, and things like, I mean, some of the blogs that are out there are actually quite good. Short pieces that are accessible that can be linked to, where you can make more direct arguments and not worry so much about the scholarly niceties of archival citations and so forth, but get to a larger audience, because you could write a blog post and then someone can link to it on Twitter and Facebook, and I think those are some of the more effective ways of getting these ideas out there. And I do think it's important that scholars do this, rather than just kind of letting the toxic pot boil on X, on Twitter and whatever. So I hope more people will do that. I don't do as much myself as I should.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Nathaniel. I really enjoyed your well, my overall impression of your presentation and also this, all these questions was that in fact this discourse of colonialism, decolonization, post-colonialism, are pretty much outdated as a conceptual paradigm. So I cannot help thinking about the Cooper's book, Colonialism Question, where he very clearly showed that in fact this discourse, this approach, this, precisely because of being so easily politicized, right, simply is kind of diverts, it's out of the picture. So we have to elaborate on some new strategical, conceptual approach. Also, as an example, I cannot help also to type subaltern studies, right? But basically also fail to find that middle ground somewhere in between this colonization discourse, right, and finally finding those indigenous voices, right, coming from the soil or whatever. So and it looks like, at least that's how I feel, that we are in this paradoxical situation when we cannot completely rely on this colonialism, the colonization discourse, precisely because of it's being very easily politicized and used for all kinds of other purposes, right? But on the other hand, we cannot tap into this soil, right? Into those so-called indigenous voices. So where is that middle ground? But do you feel this need for sort of kind of finding this indeed conceptual this how can we say the ground where we can reconcile these two discourses, because some kind of workable, efficient strategy of presenting this historical reality as objective as possible.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I think it gets into some territory that's a little bit outside my area of expertise, and also outside the Russian area. But it does occur to me that there's a kind of conceptual and almost like a developmental trap that is built into the discourse of post-coloniality and decolonization. You know, in a sense, if whatever, you know, whatever is happening in your society, you know, you keep looping back to the fact of colonialism, to the period of colonialism, to the impact of colonialism, and that becomes a kind of all-purpose, you know, catch-all explanation for issues that your society is confronting, and then it becomes a kind of well, first of all, it takes away agency. You no longer feel really empowered to actually work to build a new society, to build a new life, because you're always, you know, feeling yourself imprisoned in this, you know, cycle of colonialism. And I think some of the problems that post-colonial countries have faced, I think has stemmed from this kind of vicious cycle, this kind of trap. I think Ukraine actually is a really interesting model of a country that is not doing that. You know, ironically, I mean, in terms of the way Ukrainians have made a commitment to, you know, to the West, to a pluralistic society, to democratic processes, and even, you know, going through, for, you know, first of all, the Orange Revolution, and then Maidan. So really, you know, sacrificing a lot for this commitment to, you know, in a sense, to break free from these and actually build a new type of society, and you know, which, you know, of course, it made it, you know, it's easier for Ukraine in some ways because they have Europe right next door and they can kind of aspire to be part of that, but I think that's, you know, that's a sort of different type of model. But I think, yeah, embedding yourself too deeply in this discourse of post-coloniality and continually repeating these tropes, you know, sense locks you down. That's my sense of that.
That's really interesting. I mean, the thing is, though, that, you know, a lot of the intellectuals from one of these post-Soviet countries
Yeah,
may be locked in that discourse, right?
yeah.
And it's partly because the irony of them being trained in the West,
Yeah.
and yet a lot of people, for example, in Ukraine, still do not see the Soviet Union as an imperial colonial experience, right? So there's like this disjuncture between what the intellectuals are claiming on behalf of the people,
Yes,
which
yes.
is like the classic nationalist position.
Yeah.
And I guess I just wonder, excuse me, you know, what do we do as a practical matter when we have our colleagues from the region? I mean, so just let me back up. You said, you know, like we as Americans are maybe attracted to this kind of Puritanism, you know, a desire to do something, but you know, there are intellectuals from the region who embrace this discourse because they experienced the Soviet Union, either they and their families experienced the Soviet Union as imperialist or colonialist, like maybe they were imprisoned, you know, for speaking the indigenous language, or they suddenly have this realization as of 2022 that what they've experienced should now be viewed through a imperialist lens. But what, as a practical matter, what do we kind of do when we have, because we're, you know, we want to include, we want to have this kind of like equal relationship with maybe colleagues from the region, but maybe they themselves, and include them like on a panel, but at the same time, if they are committed to this more, you know, imperialist or even nationalist vision, and it's a kind of framework that they're engaging in as part of a political, you know, point against Russia. And then how do we kind of, I don't know what I'm at, you know, like, how do you...
I think that's a problem. And I think it's not new. And it's, you know, I was actually reading an interview with Zenut Kochan, I think is the Ukrainian historian, the 18th century historian, and he was talking about his graduate education. This would have been back in the 1960s or 1970s. working with Al Reber at UPenn and Alexander Ryzanovsky, the brother of Nikolai Ryzanovsky. And he was saying how they, they like pushed him into the 18th century because his understanding was that the nationalism will show up less then, so get him into a little safe space where he won't be but I think this is this is an issue because on the one hand you can really see how it would be offensive to scholars in these fields to feel like they're being silenced, because what they're saying sounds like intolerance or sounds like nationalism. And so, but on the other hand, sometimes it is. And so, but I think if I were, putting conferences together, putting panels together, first of all, to maintain scholarly standards. So if you're gonna make a speech that has a kind of nationalistic argument, well, I still want to see evidence. I still want to see sources. I still want to see something that meets the requirements that anyone would have for scholarship. And if they keep to that language, then we can talk. We can find common ground. And you can find things that to question perhaps what they're building their arguments off of without necessarily seeming to invalidate the whole thing. But it's a tricky moment. I think we've all run into that. The answers.
Okay, well, I think this has been a really fascinating and provocative set of comments. Thank you.